Dean Mercer pulled the 1986 Chevy Silverado into the guest parking space in front of the Vaughn Development Group tower at 8:47 in the morning, exactly where the confirmation email had told him to park. The old truck gave a low metallic exhale when he cut the engine, the sound a machine makes after 38 years of honest work, when the pistons finally stop moving and the whole frame settles into its own weight. The paint along the hood had faded from the original factory blue into something closer to the color of worn denim, and the bed held a steel toolbox, a rubber-banded stack of documents, and a folded tarp he kept for rain. Claire Vaughn stepped out of a black Escalade at the curb and looked at the Silverado. Her eyes went cold. She turned to Tyler Knox, who was standing 2 steps behind her, and said, loudly, with no particular effort to lower her voice, "Who had let that thing park in front of her building?" Dean stepped out of the cab, raised one hand, and opened his mouth to explain. Claire had already turned to her assistant. "Tow it," she said, "before the investors arrive." 30 minutes later, she was standing in a Chevrolet showroom, signing a purchase order for a new truck with her personal card. The story of what happened in those 30 minutes begins a long time before Dean Mercer drove down Peachtree Street that morning. It begins, in the way these things usually do, with a decision made in a hurry by someone who had stopped looking carefully. The Vaughn Development Group occupied floors 9 through 22 of a glass and steel tower in Midtown Atlanta, and on that particular Thursday morning the building was operating at the particular pitch of controlled urgency that precedes a major investor meeting. 3 principals from Holloway Capital, the private equity group that had committed $14 million to the Hale Street corridor redevelopment, were due at 9:15. Tyler Knox had spent the better part of the previous week preparing his presentation, a 40-slide walkthrough of the acquisition map, demolition schedule, and projected return model for what was, on paper, one of the cleanest deals Vaughn Development had closed in 3 years. Brooke Haynes had ordered extra pastries for the conference room, confirmed the AV setup twice, and printed color copies of the executive summary on the heavy cardstock that Claire reserved for significant meetings. Everything was in order. That was the agreed-upon story, at least for the next 60 minutes. Dean Mercer was a mechanic. He ran Mercer Auto and Repair off a stretch of Memorial Drive, in Decatur, a two-bay shop that he had opened 7 years ago with a small business loan and a second-hand lift that he had personally rebuilt before ever running a car over it. He employed 2 people full-time and 1 part-time, drove a truck older than most of his customers' marriages, and had a son named Nolan who was 10 years old and had recently become interested in how carburetors worked. He was not, by any measure that Tyler Knox would have recognized as relevant, someone you expected to find in the guest lot of a 40-story development company at 8:47 on a Thursday morning. But he was there, and he was there correctly, with a confirmed appointment logged in the legal department's calendar and a folder full of documents that, had anyone bothered to look at them earlier, would have saved a considerable number of people a considerable amount of trouble. The appointment had been arranged 6 days prior, after Dean received a call from Warren Hale, an 81-year-old retired school principal, whose grandfather had built the Anchor Building on the block that Vaughn Development now intended to demolish as part of Phase 2 of its Hale Street acquisition. Warren had found papers while clearing out his late mother's house. The original deed of record for a stretch of community housing on that block, filed in 1961, and a city conservation notice from 4 years ago that had never been rescinded. He had noticed, from a flyer posted in the neighborhood, that the development footprint on Vaughn's map included structures that did not, by any legal standard he could read, belong to the company. Warren did not know anyone at Vaughn Development. He knew Dean. Dean had spent the better part of 2 winters doing free repair work for half a dozen families in the Hale Street neighborhood, and Warren trusted him in the specific, unqualified way that people trust someone they've watched do the right thing without being asked. Dean had called the legal department himself. He had explained, as clearly as a man who knew nothing about property law could, that he had documents that might affect a current project. The receptionist had taken his name and number, and 2 days later someone had called back and given him a Thursday appointment at 9. He had printed the email confirmation, organized the documents in labeled sections, and driven across town to deliver them in person because Warren had asked him to make sure a human being saw them, not a fax machine. He parked in the guest lot because the email said to park in the guest lot. He was 12 minutes early because he was always 12 minutes early. The Silverado was unmistakable among its neighbors. The Range Rover to its left was a midnight blue autobiography edition that retailed for well over $200,000. The Mercedes to its right was a white S-Class with private plates. Even the pickup 2 spaces down was a late-model Ram with a chrome bumper and polished aluminum bed rails. The Chevy sat between them like a sentence written in plain language inside a document full of legal terminology. Plain enough that anyone who looked at it could understand it, but easy to skip over if you were reading for a different kind of meaning. Claire looked at it and saw a liability to her building's image. Tyler looked at it and said what he was thinking, that it looked like somebody from the maintenance crew had gotten lost on the way to the service entrance. He said it pleasantly, the way people say things they want to be heard as casual when they are not. Claire did not check the access log. She did not ask anyone whether a vehicle in the guest lot might belong to an expected visitor. She told Brooke to call security and have it towed before the 9:15 group arrived. When Dean stepped forward and identified himself, Tyler cut across him and told him the VIP lane was not accessible to the general public. Dean said he had an appointment. Tyler said there was no such appointment in the building system. Dean started to reach for the printed confirmation in his folder. Claire had already walked past him, through the glass doors, into the lobby. Over her shoulder, without turning, she told security the truck needed to be gone. Dean stood on the sidewalk and waited for what was coming. The tow truck arrived in just under 7 minutes. He did not argue with the driver, who was only doing a job he'd been sent to do. He stood with his folder under one arm and watched the hook slide into position beneath the front axle of the Silverado, and the only visible sign of what that cost him was the way his hands tightened briefly around the edge of the folder and then released. On the rearview mirror of the old truck, a small laminated photograph swayed as the vehicle tilted. A woman with dark hair, laughing outside a hardware store on a summer afternoon, holding up a paint roller like she had just won something. The tow truck turned left at the end of the drive. Dean watched until it was out of sight, then turned and walked toward the building's entrance with the folder in his hands and the expression of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that the only thing he could govern was what he did next. Dean walked to the front desk and explained, politely and in full, that he had a confirmed appointment with the legal department. The receptionist checked the system and found nothing. She suggested he call the main line to reschedule. He told her he had driven from Decatur with documentation that was time-sensitive. She said there was nothing she could do without a booking in the system, and that she was sorry for the inconvenience in the precise, practiced way of someone delivering a sentence they have said several hundred times. Brooke was standing nearby with a tablet, and Dean could see that she had heard everything, and that she was making a calculation that had less to do with him than with her own position in a building where Tyler Knox had a long memory. She said nothing. He didn't blame her. Before he had come inside, he had asked the security officer whether he could retrieve a few personal items from the truck before it left the property. The officer had said the vehicle was already on its way and that Dean would need to contact the tow company directly. Dean had thought, briefly, about the green notebook in the glove compartment. Page had started it as a practical record. Every service date, every replaced part, every mechanical decision they made on the truck over 4 years of ownership. But it had become something else over time, the way objects do when they absorb enough small moments of daily life. She had written the date they bought the truck in the upper corner of the first page. She had noted, in the margin of a July entry about changing the air filter, that Nolan had been sitting in the bed that day trying to teach himself to whistle, and had not succeeded, but had kept trying for 2 hours without complaint. She had recorded, in her careful hand, every address they had driven to for her doctor's appointments. Not the appointment details, but the route, as if the act of choosing which roads to take was something worth preserving. Dean had not been able to sell the truck after Page died. He had thought about it once, about 8 months after the funeral, when the sight of it in the driveway had become something he needed to look away from every morning. He had called a couple, asked what it was worth. The answer was not much. The market for that year and model was thin, and the truck had no collector value in the way that earlier Silverados sometimes did. He had hung up and gone back inside, and never called again. The truck wasn't worth much to the market. It was worth everything to the life he had actually lived, and those two things had nothing to do with each other. Tyler had said it from the mezzanine, casually and loudly, while talking to someone Dean couldn't see. If there had been anything valuable in that truck, it probably wouldn't have been in a truck like that. Dean heard it. He picked up his folder from the counter, squared it in his hands, and walked toward the elevator bank because he had a job to finish, and because the only effective response to that kind of statement was to be correct about the thing that mattered. He was almost to the elevator when a woman stepped out of the stairwell door with a phone in one hand and a stack of files under the other arm, and she slowed when she passed him, because she had just come through the lobby in time to catch the last few words he had spoken to the receptionist. Something about a mistake that had started before anyone had gone upstairs. She stopped, turned, and asked him who he was. Naomi Pierce ran the compliance and community liaison function at Vaughn Development, a role that had grown considerably in scope over the 3 years she had held it, because Atlanta's development landscape had grown considerably more complicated in that same period. She was methodical, fair, and constitutionally incapable of letting an irregular detail pass without following it to its source. She asked Dean who he was there to see. He showed her the email, a confirmed meeting with the legal team, 9 o'clock, regarding the Hale Street project. She pulled up the scheduling system on her phone and found the appointment. She also found the cancellation, logged 11 minutes before his arrival, under the credentials of Tyler Knox's Access account, with no explanation entered in the reason field. She walked Dean to a smaller conference room on the 3rd floor and asked him to take her through the documentation. He laid it out across the table in the order he had organized it. A side-by-side comparison of the city's official surveying boundary map and Vaughn Development's acquisition map, with a block on the east side of Hale Street outlined in red where the two diverged. On the city's version, that block was labeled and designated as Hale Street Community Housing, a preservation classification that had been on record since the conservation filing 4 years earlier, submitted jointly by the City Planning Office and a local preservation nonprofit. On Vaughn's acquisition map, the same block was marked as Phase 2 Commercial Demolition, vacant land, no occupancy. It was not vacant. 4 families lived there. The community center on the corner had operated continuously for 60 years. Dean explained how he had come to have the documents. He had been doing free maintenance work in the Hale Street neighborhood for nearly 2 years. Brake jobs, oil changes, engine diagnostics for people who couldn't easily carry that expense. Warren Hale had been one of them. When Warren found the discrepancy between the development map and his family's deed records, he had asked Dean to bring the papers somewhere they would be seen by someone with the authority to act on them. Dean had made the appointment himself. He had no legal standing, no professional credentials in property law, and no personal stake in the outcome, beyond the fact that he believed Warren and he could read a map. He had driven across town to make sure a human being looked at the documents before the company poured concrete on someone's front steps. Naomi listened to all of it without interrupting. She looked at the surveying overlay for a long time. She looked at the conservation filing, which had a city reference number that could be verified in under 4 minutes on any public records portal. She looked at the printout of Dean's appointment and the printout of its cancellation and did not say what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was something she needed to confirm before she put it into words. She told Dean to stay in the room, that she would be back. She picked up the folder and walked to the elevator. In the conference room, she checked the public records portal on her tablet. The conservation designation was current and active. The deed of record was filed and uncontested. The community housing classification had never been modified or rescinded. None of this information appeared anywhere in the project file she pulled from the shared drive. There was, however, an email thread, flagged internal, visible to her compliance access level, in which a junior analyst had raised a boundary concern 8 weeks earlier and been told, by Tyler, to hold the question until after the investor presentation closed. Then her phone rang. It was the tow company. The Silverado had been hooked incorrectly, dragged along the pavement for close to a full block before the driver had corrected his approach. The left rear axle had been damaged. The bed frame had sustained new stress along an existing weld line. The truck was technically mobile, but structurally compromised for load-bearing work. She went back to the conference room. She told Dean. He was quiet for a long moment. He said he could fix metal. He said some things broke because people chose not to listen early enough. And that kind of damage was harder to address than a bent axle, because the bent axle at least showed you where the problem was. Naomi picked up the folder and walked upstairs. Tyler had just said the phrase "clean title." No outstanding claims when Naomi opened the conference room door on the 22nd floor and asked the room to pause. There were 11 people at that table, Claire at the head, Tyler at the presentation screen, 3 principals from Holloway Capital, 2 lead attorneys from Vaughn Development's legal team, the project engineering director, 2 development analysts, and Brooke at the side table with her laptop. The investors were courteous and attentive, and had calendars that did not accommodate delays, and the interruption landed in the room the way unexpected things land in carefully managed environments, with a specific, uncomfortable silence. Claire said, with measured patience, that now was not the time. Naomi said, without apology, that it was exactly the time and set the folder on the table in front of Claire. The room held its breath. Claire opened it. The first document was the surveying overlay. 2 maps. Side by side, the discrepancy outlined in red on the city version and absent entirely from Vaughn's. The second was the conservation filing with the city reference number. The third was Warren Hale's deed of record. The fourth was Dean's appointment confirmation and the time-stamped cancellation logged under Tyler's account. Claire went through them in order, one by one, without speaking. Her expression did not change, but the quality of her silence changed. It became the silence of someone whose understanding of the past several hours was reorganizing itself around a new set of facts. Tyler said the documents were from an unverified outside source, that the surveying comparison was based on outdated city records, and that the conservation filing had never been formally incorporated into the development review process. He said this smoothly and quickly, the way a person says things they have rehearsed at least partly for this contingency. Claire looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he stopped talking. Then she asked Naomi to bring Dean up. Tyler said, with an edge that had not been there before, that bringing a mechanic into an investor meeting was not the company's standard for due diligence review. Nobody responded to that. Dean came in 60 seconds later. He sat down at the table without being told where, opened nothing, said nothing until he was asked, and then answered the lead attorney's first two questions in plain, factual language that referenced specific documents on the table in front of them. When Tyler said, again, that Dean did not possess the professional qualifications to make legal determinations about property records, Dean looked at him and said, without elevation or hurry, that a person did not need a law degree to understand the difference between a house with a family in it and an empty box on a development map. The lead investor from Holloway Capital uncapped his pen, looked at the document in front of him, and made a note. The room stayed quiet for a moment after that. Claire sat with the folder open and the surveying overlay in front of her, and she did the accounting that every honest person in a leadership position eventually has to do. Not the financial accounting, which the attorneys would handle, but the human one. A man had driven across Atlanta that morning to prevent her company from tearing down someone's home. He had done it correctly, through the proper channels, with a confirmed appointment and documented evidence. He had been turned away from the guest lot, had his vehicle towed from a space where he had every right to park it, had been dismissed by her head of development in front of security and junior staff, and had still managed to get the documents upstairs through the only avenue still available to him. And she had not looked at him once with anything other than the assumption that he did not belong. Brooke's phone lit up silently on the side table. She looked at it, looked at Claire, and said quietly that it was the tow company calling back about the vehicle. The damage estimate was complete. The cost to restore the axle and frame was significant. Claire stood, told the room the project was paused pending a full title review, and asked Dean to come with her. The impound lot was on a service road behind a strip of storage warehouses in West Atlanta, and the Silverado sat in the far corner of the chain link yard at a slight and unmistakable list, one rear wheel resting on a concrete curb, the whole body carrying the particular look of something that has been handled without care by people who did not understand what they were handling. Up close, the damage was plainly visible. The left rear axle drawn out of true, the bumper torqued inward along the right side, the steel toolbox knocked open in the bed, wrenches and sockets, and a blue-handled socket driver scattered across the floor of the bed in a way that suggested a sudden jolt. The door on the passenger side opened with the familiar sound Dean had heard 10,000 times. A specific metal resistance that he had adjusted twice, once in the spring 3 years ago, and once last winter when the weather stripped the grease from the hinges. He reached in and took 3 things: the laminated photograph from the mirror, the green notebook from the glove compartment, and a socket wrench from under the passenger seat that his father had handed to him on the day he signed the lease for the shop, without ceremony, just pressing it into his hands and saying, "Every job is the same job, you just need the right tools." Claire stood a few feet back and said nothing. She watched the way Dean handled each object. Not reverently, not with drama, but with the simple, habitual care of someone returning something to its correct place. She stepped forward when he set the notebook on the tailgate. She did not ask to look at it. She looked at it because it was open, and because the handwriting on the visible page was in 2 different hands. One larger and deliberate across the main lines, one smaller and looping in the margins. The smaller hand had written, on the margin of a page that appeared to document a brake line replacement, that Nolan had been 4 years old, and had carried one of the brake line sections from the garage to the driveway, holding it above his head like a trophy, convinced he had done something important. It was a 3-line margin note. Claire read it twice. She put the notebook down and did not say anything, because there is a moment in the presence of grief when additional words are not an addition. She asked Brooke, who had driven separately, to find the nearest Chevrolet dealership. 31 minutes later, they were at a dealership on Marietta Boulevard, and Claire walked to a 2024 Silverado 2500 HD in deep navy without consulting a salesperson. She asked the fleet manager 2 questions, payload capacity and towing rating, and then said she would take it. The truck was built for exactly the kind of daily commercial work Dean's shop required. Heavy equipment hauling, tool transport, consistent towing without the wear that lighter half-ton trucks accumulated over a hard-working season. The fleet manager brought the purchase paperwork. Claire signed it with her personal card, not the company account. The distinction mattered to her, and she made sure it was noted. When the key was in her hand, she turned to Dean and held it out. She said she didn't believe the new truck replaced what had been towed away. She said she understood, or was beginning to understand, that those were not the same thing. She said she wanted to start by taking responsibility in the most concrete way available to her in that moment. Dean looked at the key for a while without taking it. Then he asked whether she understood where the mistake had actually started. Not the tow order. Not the moment the hook went under the axle. He asked her to go back further. She was quiet. The showroom was quiet around them. A salesperson at a distant desk pretending to read something, the fluorescent lights running their steady hum, and the particular silence of a space where people come to make decisions. Claire looked at the key in her outstretched hand, and then she said it. She had seen a worn-out truck, and she had made a judgment, and she had never looked past the truck to the person standing beside it. Dean took the key. He held it for a moment, then said the old Chevy still needed to be restored, not replaced, restored, that she owed it that for a different reason than the new one. She said she agreed. She said she would cover every cost of the restoration, not to cancel out the mistake, but because the notebook she had seen deserved a running vehicle around it for as long as it could be kept running. Claire returned to the building that afternoon, with a clarity she had not carried going out. The investor meeting was still technically in session. The Holloway principals had agreed to wait because a deal under legal review was not a dead deal, and because one of them, the eldest of the 3, had been in enough rooms over 40 years to recognize the difference between a company that managed its mistakes and one that buried them. Dean came with her. Warren Hale was already in the lobby when they arrived, seated in one of the low, modern chairs near the entrance, his hat in his lap, his patience the patience of a man who had been waiting for the right outcome for far longer than one afternoon. Naomi had organized the evidence into a clear sequence. She presented it in the main conference room on the 15th floor, with the full project team present alongside the investment principals, Warren and a representative from the Hale Street Neighborhood Association, and the company's 2 lead attorneys. She walked through it in chronological order. The junior analyst's boundary concern, raised 8 weeks prior, tabled on Tyler's instruction. The conservation filing, present in public records and absent from the project file. The deed of record Warren had found, and which had never been cross-referenced against the acquisition map. The scheduling entry for Dean's appointment and the time-stamped cancellation logged under Tyler's Access account, 11 minutes before Dean had arrived in the parking lot. She set printed copies of the relevant emails in front of the lead investor. She said nothing editorially about what the emails demonstrated. She didn't need to. Tyler made 2 attempts to reshape the presentation. He said the conservancy filing had not been formally incorporated into the development intake review, which was technically true and entirely beside the point. He said Dean had no standing to speak authoritatively on property records, and when the room did not respond to that, he said that the company's standard review process had not been designed to accommodate walk-in documentation from uninvited contractors. Dean waited for the room to settle before he responded. He said that if a company only opened its doors to the information delivered by people wearing the right clothes and holding the right credentials, it would spend a long time missing the people who showed up carrying the truth in a toolbox. The room stayed quiet after that. One of the Holloway principals looked at Tyler for a long moment and then at Claire, and the look communicated something that did not require elaboration. Claire did not deflect. She told the room, the investors, the legal team, her own staff, Warren Hale, and the neighborhood association representative, that the order to tow the vehicle had been hers, made without checking the visitor log, based on an assumption she had not examined. She said the environment in which a junior analyst documented concern could be set aside for 8 weeks without escalation was a management failure, and that it had occurred during her tenure and on her watch. She said both things plainly, without the softening language that made accountability easier to deliver and less meaningful to receive. Tyler began to respond. She asked him to stop, and when he did not stop immediately, she said his name once, quietly, and he stopped. She told him he was suspended, effective immediately, and that his building access would be deactivated by the end of business. A full audit of the Hale Street acquisition file and of the 2 prior projects in which he had served as lead development officer would begin the following morning. The project was restructured in the 90 minutes that followed. The community housing block would be preserved. The development footprint would be redrawn. The community center building, Warren's grandfather's building, in continuous operation since 1952, would not be touched. A remediation fund, jointly capitalized by Vaughn Development and a city preservation grant Naomi had identified that afternoon, would finance structural repairs and modernization of the housing units that had been classified for demolition. The Holloway principals signed the revised term sheet before they left the building. As they were going, the eldest of the 3 paused at the conference room door and told Claire, without sentiment, that he had seen more deals collapse under the weight of uncorrected errors than under the weight of corrected ones, and that he appreciated the distinction. After the investors had gone, Claire stood at the front of the conference room with the remaining staff and said what she needed to say in full. She said she had bought a new truck that morning. She let that statement sit in the room for a moment before she continued. She said that the new truck was the easiest part of what she owed, that the thing she had actually incurred that day was a debt that no purchase order could settle, the price of an arrogance that had gone so long without examination that she had stopped knowing it was there. She said she intended to pay that debt in the only currency it could actually be paid in, which was changed behavior over time in situations she had not yet encountered. The room was quiet when she finished. Not the managed quiet of people waiting for permission to respond, but the genuine quiet of people absorbing something that had no obvious follow-up. Several weeks passed. The new Silverado became part of the daily rhythm of Mercer Auto and Repair. Parked against the chain-link fence in the mornings before the shop opened, backed up to job sites in the evenings, sitting in the lot of the lumber yard on Saturdays when Dean sourced materials for the Hale Street remediation work that Warren had asked him to help oversee. His 2 full-time employees noticed the truck immediately. It could carry the full weight of a rebuilt engine block without protest, held the highway at speed without wind noise from a weather stripping gap, and had a backup camera that one of them, Marcus, said felt like cheating after 20 years of turning around to look. The truck did what a good tool does. It made the work cleaner and quieter, and did not draw attention to itself. The 1986 sat inside the bay on the lift, patiently disassembled. Dean had taken it apart in the careful, systematic way that he approached every restoration, not stripping it down all at once, but working section by section, cataloging what could be saved and what needed replacement, keeping the components organized on rolling carts in the order in which they would eventually go back together. A restoration specialist he knew from a shop in Decatur came by twice a week to consult on the bodywork, and they had sourced a matched original spec axle assembly from a salvage yard in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The frame weld had been reinforced by a metalwork shop in East Atlanta that specialized in vintage truck restoration. The interior had been stripped to the firewall, and the factory bench seat was at an upholstery shop being redone in the original vinyl pattern, dark gray with a thin white welt seam, the same pattern that had been in the truck when Dean and Paige had driven it off the estate sale lot in Decatur on a Saturday morning in October 8 years ago, with Nolan asleep in the back seat and a hardware store brochure marked up in Paige's handwriting on the dashboard. The audit of Tyler's project files turned up a broader pattern than the Hale Street boundary issue alone. 2 prior projects contained documentation gaps consistent with selective management of unfavorable information. Tyler left the company at the end of the review period, which his attorney negotiated as a mutual separation rather than a formal termination, though the distinction was largely semantic, and everyone who worked at Vaughn Development understood the substance of it. Brooke came by the shop one afternoon with paperwork from the legal team, and when she had finished her business reason for being there, she stood for a moment at the edge of the bay and told Dean she was sorry she had stayed quiet in the lobby when he had been standing at the reception desk with a full folder of evidence and nothing protecting him but his own composure. She said it simply, without asking for absolution. Dean thanked her and meant it, and she drove back to the office. Warren brought coffee one Saturday morning and stayed for an hour, sitting on an overturned milk crate near the lift while Dean worked. He said word had moved through the Hale Street neighborhood about what had happened and that people had a lot of feelings about it that they weren't sure how to name. Dean said they didn't need to name them. He said the reason he had driven downtown with those papers was not for recognition or for drama, and that the only outcome he had cared about from the beginning was the one that had actually happened. The houses were still standing. Warren was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he thought Dean might not fully appreciate how rare that kind of person was, and Dean said he appreciated it fine, he just didn't think it required a ceremony. Nolan asked his father one evening at the kitchen table, while working on a school project about simple machines, whether he liked the new truck better than the old one. Dean put down his coffee cup. He took the question seriously, the way he took questions from Nolan seriously, because he believed that a child asking a question in good faith deserved an answer in good faith. He said the new truck was good at its job and would serve them well for years. It was reliable and powerful, and had enough capability to handle the work that was growing as the shop's reputation grew. But he said the old truck held something that the new one couldn't be given, no matter how much it cost or how well it was built. The new truck could take you wherever you needed to go next. The old one reminded you of why you had started going in the first place, and who had been beside you when you did. Nolan wrote something in the margin of his notebook, not for the assignment, just for himself, and did not ask a follow-up question, which Dean recognized as the sign of a child filing something away for later, in the part of themselves they return to when things become complicated. The afternoon light in late October fell long and amber through the western windows of the shop, laying itself across the concrete floor in warm, wide rectangles that moved almost imperceptibly as the day wound down. The new Silverado sat outside against the chain link, its dark navy finish holding the low sun in a clean, even reflection. Inside the bay, the 1986 was elevated on the lift, surrounded by its own cataloged components, waiting in the patient way of something that understood it would eventually be whole again. Dean was at the workbench with his back to the door, cleaning a bracket, when a car pulled into the lot with an engine note he didn't recognize, and then footsteps on the concrete that weren't his mechanic's. He turned around. Claire Vaughn walked in carrying a flat cardboard box. She was not in the fitted dark suit she had worn on Peachtree Street. She was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow, and she set the box on the workbench and opened it without preamble. Factory specification restoration parts for a 1986 Silverado, ordered through Chevrolet's Heritage Preservation Supplier Catalog. The kind of components that took weeks to source and cost considerably more than their aftermarket equivalents because they were correct in every dimension that mattered. Not a check, not an arrangement made through the company's vendor accounts. Parts carried in by hand by a woman who had looked up what the truck specifically needed and gone through the specific effort of obtaining those exact things. She told him she did not know how to work on vehicles. She said she had never learned, that it had never seemed relevant, and that she was starting to understand the size of what she had dismissed without examination because it didn't fit inside the frame she had built for what competence and credibility were supposed to look like. She said she could learn to be useful without being in the way if he was willing to let her try. Dean set down the rag. He looked at her for a moment, not weighing anything, just seeing what was there, and said that was a better place to start than most people found their way to. He took a clean rag from the shelf and held it out to her, and nodded toward a bracket on the rolling cart that needed to be wiped down before it went back onto the frame. She took the rag. She got to work. Outside, the new Silverado sat with its nose pointed toward the long road of everything still ahead of it. Inside, under the steady warmth of the shop lamps, the old one waited in the amber light. Not diminished, not discarded, but mid-restoration, each component being returned to it with care and intention. Not because it had monetary value, not because it was practical, but because someone had finally stood still long enough to understand that certain things cannot be measured by what they cost, only by what they have already carried, and that a person with enough humility to recognize that distinction is, in the end, worth far more than any truck, old or new, that ever rolled into a parking lot looking for a place to belong.